Across rural America, terrified witnesses are encountering horrific, skeletal, thin humanoid creatures with sharp claws and mouths full of needle-like teeth. These ghoulish beings have been dubbed crawlers, and their presence seems to inspire primal, instinctual terror in those unlucky enough to cross their path. In today's episode, we're going to investigate this growing phenomenon and the truly bone-chilling crawler and rake sightings emerging from the darkened woods and lonely backcountry roads. From a young boy's traumatic encounter with a pale, skeletal creature barreling through the woods to a group of friends whose late-night drive is interrupted by something otherworldly, something sinister lurks out there. Just what are these creatures? These macabre and shocking accounts are straight from the eyewitnesses themselves. You don't want to miss this episode. Moving from the city to the country always comes as a shock. I mean, the dull gray of skyscrapers gives way to the lush green of forests. The hustle and bustle of the crowds becomes the quiet, introspective stillness of isolation. Honking horns and wailing sirens are replaced by the whispering wind and singing birds. All of these changes can simply overwhelm your senses. Most of us would agree that after you acclimate yourself, all of these differences can become positive influences. But sometimes the change is much more sinister, much darker. Although he didn't know it at the time, this was exactly what Nico was going to experience when his family moved from the busy metropolitan center of Atlanta to the mountains of Georgia-Alabama border. He was just 8 years old at the time, and he would say this: "At some point, I started to feel really uneasy, so I told my mom. She wrote it off as a symptom of the major life change, or something to that effect. I did my best to just accept it as nothing more than that, but the anxiety and sense of oppression got a lot worse. It seemed that the heavy feeling directly correlated to the proximity to my new home. That was a feeling that I would live with for more than a decade, and I would soon find out that it was nothing in relation to what I would soon experience." The family had moved to Hignan, Alabama, near a landmark known as Sand Mountain. There, they made a new life for themselves and a trailer at a very end of a long, isolated driveway that would snake through the forest. Now, Nico's room sat on the opposite end of the trailer from where his mother and his stepfather had stayed. It included a large bay window, which is important to his story. Now, soon, the novelty of Nico's new surroundings wore off. He had no longer found himself uneasy or overstimulated by the wilderness. More than anything else, he was simply bored. All he wanted was just a little excitement, but little did he realize that boredom was far better than the excitement that would come his way. Now, one night, a few months after they had moved, Nico settled into bed after a long day of exploring the surrounding woods. Now, despite being exhausted from the sheer exertion of his adventure, his mind was racing. He could not fall asleep. Now, finally, in desperation, he turns on the TV, tuning into the Cartoon Network in the hopes that it might lull him to sleep. And Nico isn't sure what happened next. He understands that many people will simply think that he was dreaming, but for Nico, it felt all too real. And somehow Nico had found himself all alone in the forest, and judging from his surroundings, he had been transported to the southeastern portion of his parents' property. Still, this was a best guess. While he had visited that area before, he was far from familiar with it. But a few landmarks here and there looked recognizable enough. Now, Nico finds it difficult to describe the sensation that followed while he was in the woods. It wasn't his own self navigating through the trees. It was almost as if his mind had hijacked someone else's body, or more accurately, since he couldn't control his movements, like he was piggybacking someone else's consciousness. Now, this sensation of detachment only magnified once the body he was inside started moving. Everything was too fast. The body darted around the tree trunks and over the rough terrain with a speed and grace beyond anything Nico was capable of himself. Simply put, it did not feel like he was inside a human body. The experience was beginning to make Nico feel even more disoriented. The body he was trapped within zipped from tree to tree, taking cover in a precise, strategic manner that he compared to a predator stalking its prey. Now at last, the body stopped again, giving Nico a chance to recover. As soon as he reoriented himself, he snaps back into his own body, lounging in bed in the trailer. Relieved, he tried his best to push the experience from his mind and managed to drift off to sleep. Now, Nico says this exact same scenario played out several nights in a row. Nico began to notice a pattern. Each time, he lingered a bit longer in this outer body. He couldn't put a precise duration on any of the experiences, other than that they simply seemed to take longer and longer each time. There was one other difference. The experience didn't reset at the same place each night. Whenever he found himself inside the other body, Nico said that the experience simply picked up where it left off the night before. But one thing became clear: whatever he was seeing, whatever his mind was inside, had a destination in mind, but it could only get there while Nico was piggybacking. And these out-of-body travels became commonplace until one evening, Nico finally saw the other body's objective. Now, to his surprise, it wasn't content to linger in the woods. It was heading towards the clearing where the trailer sat. Now, this realization jettisoned Nico straight back into his own body, although he couldn't be sure if this was his decision or not. Either way, he was back in bed, but his experience wasn't going over. It wasn't going to make the jump from his dreams into his reality. Nico said this: "I sat straight up and turned toward the window. I just knew that it was there, that it was a few feet outside of the tree line. As much as I didn't want to, I still gathered myself up and looked out that bay window at the tree line. It was there, leaning from behind a large tree right at the edge of the woods. It was tall, very tall, and its skin was taut, like it was stretched over its bones. I don't really remember any detail of its skeletal anatomy. All of its features were grotesquely elongated, like they were stretched out purposely. It had long, clawed fingers that curled around into the common sign that you would use to beckon someone closer to you. Its face was large and humanoid, but with that same stretched out look. It had a smile that was impossibly wide and large, long, sharp teeth, skinny and needle-like. Its eyes were really big. It just stood there, staring at me through my window. It cocked its head and motioned for me to come to it. I call it the Gray Man, although it had no discernible gender." Nico says that this sight frightened him more than anything he ever experienced. He had no idea how primal, how animalistic terror could actually become. Yet, alongside this instinctual reaction was another urge. According to Nico, he had to actively fight an almost uncontrollable impulse to go out to the Gray Man. Now, wisely, he resisted, instead choosing to cower under the covers of his bed, hoping and praying that he had more patience than the intruder. It was simply a waiting game. All he had to do was wait for the Gray Man to give up. And when the morning came, the thin figure by the edge of the forest was gone, but it had not given up. You see, night after night, Nico was forced to endure further visits from the Gray Man. And it got so predictable that he wouldn't even bother trying to sleep in his bed, instead preferring the security of the living room closer to where his mother and stepfather had slept. And even then, the scenario played out almost identically every time, with one fortune change. On each visit, the compulsion to run out to meet the Gray Man subsided, until at last he felt no desire to leave the trailer. Now, by this time, Nico was sleep deprived. Combined with other household drama, it brought him to his breaking point. and the gray man never really went away. To the contrary, as the desire to go outside weakened, the figure only drew nearer and nearer to the walls of the trailer each and every evening. The only thing that made the gray man vanish from Nico's life was another visitor. How Nico concluded his story is a bit vague, but it suggests that he has never fully escaped the grip of the supernatural. He says this: "One night, I awoke to this thing, something different perched on the bottom railing of my bed. The only way I can describe it was kind of like the faun from Pan's Labyrinth. It looked much different than that character, but it's as close to an analog as I can come up with. It told me that it would get rid of the gray man, but for a price. The faun had a different energy to it than the gray man did, but I don't think it was something that was of good intent. It had a mild, almost predatory optimism at best. I was desperate and exhausted, so whatever it wanted from me, whatever price it required, I paid it. It did indeed keep up its end of the bargain, until I ended up accidentally opening up the door for this thing to re-enter some years later. My life did return to a kind of normal. Well, in some ways." While it is unclear exactly what happened to Nico after that or what this second entity represents, the gray man itself seems to be a variation on a recurring cryptid which has been cited more and more often in the recent years: the rake. Generally speaking, rakes, which are sometimes called crawlers or pale crawlers, are described as tall, rail-thin humanoids, although they rarely stand upright. Instead, choosing to scramble around on all fours, their skin is almost always white or shades of gray. The faces of rakes will vary widely. Sometimes they are blank, others exhibit human features, although the noses are absent or vestigial, the eyes oversized, glowing, or both. And when they have them, their mouths are often lined with teeth, their jaws sometimes hinged at the chin rather than on the face. Now, skeptics will tell you that the rake is solely a creation of the internet like Slender Man, nothing more than creepypasta. And they most often point to photoshopped images on Reddit that began emerging right around the 2010s. But around that same time, sightings would increase dramatically. With debunking rakes, skeptics also cite numerous similar creatures from pop culture, from the monsters in the 2005 horror film The Descent to the characters of Gollum in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Now, it is true that rakes and crawlers, whatever you want to call them, have thrived in online culture. Videos and photographs taken by cell phones and trail cams do populate the internet. And sometimes, rake proponents eager to prove that the creature has a basis in older folklore label these sightings as skinwalkers, supernatural dark magicians from Navajo belief. But folks, at the same time, the paranormal seems to have little regard for the boundaries we have erected between fact and fiction. In fact, numerous ancient traditions speak of the ability for thoughts to manifest into our own physical world. Depending on the tradition, these might be known as egregores, thoughts that congeal into reality at the cultural level, or tulpas, thoughts becoming flesh from the dedicated practice of an individual. Now, if our understanding of reality is flawed in any way, it seems possible, if not necessarily probable, that the rakes literally sprung from our collective imagination into our shared existence. Now, even if this is not the case, sightings of rakes and pale crawlers far predate the rise of the internet. I mean, one of the earliest and easily the most famous sightings occurred on April 21st, 1977. Around 10:30 that evening, a trio of 17-year-old students were passing through Dover, Massachusetts, an affluent suburb not far from Boston. Many of the neighborhoods in the community are bordered by old, low stone walls which dropped in and out of the car's headlights as they moved towards their destination. Only Bill Bartlett saw the creature as the other two boys were focusing elsewhere. But Bill was sure of what he saw, a figure crouched along one of the stone walls, not more than 4 feet tall, its large head easily as large as the rest of its body, combined was a shape like a watermelon, sat atop a skeletal frame. Each of the creature's frail appendages ended in large hands and feet, and the entire thing was covered in hairless skin the color of a peach. Its face had no features that were immediately recognizable, except for a pair of orange marble-sized eyes. Now, apparently, the thing had been picking its way along the wall when it got caught in the headlights. Now, Bill's entire sighting only lasted a few seconds, but he was certain that it was neither a human being nor any natural feature in the landscape. Although none of the other passengers shared Bill's sighting, they swore that their friend was visibly shaken by what he had witnessed. And so when he got home, Bill immediately sketched out his impression of the creature. It was the first depiction of what became known in local newspapers as the Dover Demon. The Dover Demon put in one other appearance that night. The fact that it came from an unrelated witness several hours later did seem to corroborate Bill Bartlett's story. Sometime around midnight, 15-year-old John Baxter had decided to head home from his girlfriend's house. As he moved down the darkened blacktop, he noticed a short figure walking towards him in the distance. Thinking it was a friend, John calls out, but receives no answer. And after a little more walking, the figure stops in its tracks, and so John did the same. And when he finally took another step forward for a closer look, the shape scuttled off to the left shoulder of the road, disappearing into a shallow tree-lined gully before popping up on the other side. And so John cautiously followed the stranger downhill. Now, when he looks in the direction that the figure had headed, he saw this short being whose silhouette perfectly matched Bill Bartlett's description no more than 30 feet away. Now, the Dover Demon stood there holding an adjacent tree with both hands, and its long, thin fingers wrapped around the trunk. Its feet did the same, gripping a large boulder beneath it so tightly that they almost appeared molded to the rock. And so John backs away slowly, and when he reached the road, he broke into a brisk walk. Now, upon reaching home, he also sketched the creature, providing our second depiction of the Dover Demon. Now, comparing his art and that of Bill Bartlett's side by side, well, folks, the comparisons are obvious. One final witness would emerge. The following day, Bill shared his sighting of the creature in the headlights with his friend, 18-year-old Will Tainter. That evening, Will was driving 15-year-old Abby Brabham back to her home when she spotted something in the car's headlights. Perched on the left-hand side of the road, facing the car, was a small, hairless figure, thin and monkey-like. As in Bill's sighting, the only thing on its face were a pair of eyes, which glowed green instead of the orange hue Bill had noted. Abby's sighting lasted only a heartbeat as Will's car hurtled along the road. So, given the Dover Demon sighting of 1977, it seems as if pale crawlers and rakes have been seen for nearly 50 years now. You could probably make an argument that similar creatures can be found in various folklores and even indigenous beliefs from all around the world. But the rake is still seen today. Now, why is that? One of the most recent sightings occurred in the late summer of 2023. The witness, whom we will call Darius, had just moved onto 11 acres of rural property between Smiley and Yorktown, Texas. The adjacent area, although Darius didn't own it, was also for sale, meaning that he was surrounded by 50 or so acres of untamed wilderness, only broken by the orange glow of the oil pumps flaming from time to time out in the distance. Now, Darius's house was not only tiny, it was unfinished. The walls hadn't even been put up inside, but he and his girlfriend were committed to working on it while they were there. Talk about a fixer-upper. Now, to be clear, Darius was never a believer in anything supernatural. He is a pragmatic fellow, only believing in what he can see, what is in front of him physically. So when he saw the rake, he believed it. Now, from the moment he and his girlfriend moved into the house, they started noticing strange, technological glitches. I mean, cameras would short out and cell phones would shut down on their own. Even their cars weren't immune to the strangeness, chiming and flashing their lights when parked in the driveway. Now, Darius knew all this was odd, but didn't think much of it. Well, until one night when he had to retrieve something from his car. You see, after opening the door, Darius switched on his flashlight on his phone and he began rummaging around through the inside of his vehicle. And after failing to find what he needed, he no longer remembered what it was, but he shut the door in defeat and headed back towards the house, the tiny light on his phone showing him the way. And that's when he saw it and he believed. Darius would say this: "There was a truck parked between me and the door to the house. As I shone my light towards the truck, I became instantly terrified. What I saw was a tall, 7 to 8 foot humanoid creature with white, sort of sickly looking skin. Its arms and legs looked longer than a human's. Now, as I shone my light in that direction, it ran off. It had the capability to leap over the truck, landing in the bed momentarily before hopping over the other edge and disappearing beyond my sight. I distinctly remember how the truck shook when it nimbly jumped over it. The time it took to do that was about 4 to 5 seconds. I never got to see its face, and I'm glad I didn't, as I would probably be even more traumatized than I already am. I can only imagine what its face looked like." Now, Darius realizes that in hindsight, the wisest thing he could have done was to take shelter in his own car. Instead, he ran into the house, locks the door, and thankful that he didn't encounter the thing waiting for him on the opposite side of the truck. Now, according to Darius, he spent the next month in absolute terror, fearing that he would once again see the same thing lurking about his property. Now, luckily, he didn't, but his girlfriend said that she had caught a glimpse of something similar through one of the windows. They moved away from the property just a short time later. Darius called that night the scariest moment of his life. He would even add that he was traumatized from the experience and realizes that it seems silly, and he was even embarrassed to say that it's true he is never moving to the countryside ever again. Now, although many researchers flat out refuse to take sightings of rakes and pale crawlers and creatures remotely seriously, one cryptozoologist has chosen to break this taboo. You see, in 2023, author Nathaniel Brislin released the book Crawlers, a Conclusive Casebook, and his work compiles 35 sightings of the creatures, and to his credit, Nathaniel did the legwork required for such an in-depth study. While many witnesses share their stories online and hide behind a wall of anonymity, the people in Nathaniel's book were subjected to extensive interviews to vet their honesty. Kudos to Nathaniel, everyone. That is amazing. Now, the end result provides readers with some of the best authenticated sightings of rakes and crawlers ever compiled. Now, one of the people Nathaniel spoke with was a man by the name of Michael Walker, a man who grew up near Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, Michael claims to have spotted these terrifying humanoids on several occasions. The first time was when Michael was only 13, sometime in the summer of 2014. The property he lived on included numerous game trails, and Michael was traveling one of these pathways when he heard a loud thud just a few yards into the forest. Michael described what he saw. "I looked over just in time to see something humanoid barreling off into the forest on all fours. It was naked and its skin was paper white. That was all I could discern. I could only see it for a couple of seconds before it vanished. I didn't see it again for several weeks until I was coming out of the forest through a path behind my grandparents' house. It was raining, and I was running to make it back home when I heard something shuffling in one of the sheds in my grandparents' backyard. I thought this was weird, considering the sheds were full of clutter and old junk that we didn't even use, so there shouldn't have been anyone in there. I looked inside, and that's when I saw what I've come to call the Pale Man up close. It was completely hairless and crouched down in the piles of junk with its back turned to me. It was very thin with a human-like body with visible ribs and strangely long limbs. It looked back over its shoulder to look at me, and I could see that it had deep black eye sockets with wide eyes staring back at me. It didn't have any lips, just teeth, and a mouth pulled back in a horrible grimace. It also didn't have a nose. It screeched at me, and that's when I ran back to my house. Now, a friend of Michael's had experienced something very similar in that same year that he had encountered the Pale Man. In this case, the witness was in a deer stand when he would glance out the window, only to see a ghastly pale face staring back at him 15 feet above the forest floor. Being seen by Michael's friend seemed to startle the Pale Man to an equal degree, and the creature released its grip, sending it tumbling to the ground with a loud thump. Michael's friend then watched as the rake limped into the forest on its hands and feet. Michael was horrified when he learned that the location of the deer stand was just around the corner from his home. It suggested that they had both seen the same nightmarish entity in the Mississippi woods. Now, in the years since his initial sighting, Michael has taken a keen interest in the paranormal. On several occasions, he thinks that he has caught not only glimpses of this Pale Man, but also stick structures that he suspects the creature has left on his property. Now, our final story doesn't come from Nathaniel Brislin's book, but is nonetheless interesting. On June 27, 2021, a witness near the Illinois-Missouri border was spending time with his friends when he spotted something that terrified him on a rural country road. The witness admits to struggling with anxiety, a condition that often leaves her paranoid. On the night in question, her emotions were running high when she got a message from her friends. They wanted to pick up some food, hang out, and go for a drive. Now, at first, it didn't seem like a good idea, given that she was experiencing an anxiety attack. But on second thought, maybe it was just what she needed. With that in mind, she and her mother walk out to her car, who reassured her the whole way, then set off to pick up her friends. And after she gathered everyone together, they picked up some food at McDonald's on the eastern side of St. Louis, and then continued on their drive. Now, it wasn't much, but it was about all that they could do for the entertainment at their age in this part of the country. The witness described how she came to see the rake, writing this: "We were coming back into town sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, and we noticed the moon appeared red. So we started talking about it, and we began arguing about what effects a red moon has on people. Just as we started getting loud, we saw a creature on the side of the road. It seemed to be humanoid, but its forearms were much longer than its upper arms. It was very pale, almost grayish in color with no hair. The fingers were very long and pointy, maybe claws. It also appeared to be very malnourished. We could even see its rib cage. It was crouched down next to a telephone pole just as we were coming into town. So I slammed on the brakes, turned on my brights to get a better look at it. It looked at us and then zoomed up the pole faster than what should be physically possible. It was like a beam of light. We all went silent and started discussing what we had just seen. We all agreed that we had seen the same thing. All of our descriptions were the same." Now, following this alarming encounter, the witness's anxiety and paranoia were running full blast. As luck would have it, they weren't far from one of the friends' houses, so she wanted to run inside and grab something. Her friend went inside, leaving the witness in the car. Although she had locked the doors, it was taking everything in her power not to panic. Finally, the friend returns. After she hops inside, the witness threw the car in reverse, looked out the back window, only to see the same figure standing there in the middle of the road, bathed blood red in the car's brake lights. Now, as soon as she was able to turn the car around, the witness slams on the gas, rushes home, which was only a few blocks away. They all took refuge in the witness's home for a few hours, discussing what they had seen before finally summoning the courage to return to their respective homes. Rakes and pale crawlers are fascinating because of how they emphasize the power of storytelling, how they show the porous boundaries between fact and fiction, allowing creatures of the imagination to step into our own world, where they take on some sort of objective reality, no matter how small. Ideas and stories are as contagious as any pathogen, making their way through societies and cultures with astounding rapidity. Although creatures resembling the rake didn't originate online, they certainly took root there and spread like wildfire. Some even seem to have bled into our consensus reality. If this is indeed what is happening, we should take it as a warning. Be careful what you imagine, what you place your focus on. Don't think up anything you wouldn't want to meet in person. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below. You're looking a little pale, so I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more videos like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys all in the very next episode.